Hi, my name is Katie Brewer, and my presentation is going to be about cultural differences in dealing with death and dying. Part of human development is accepting death when it comes, whether to a loved one or when it is your turn to go. Everyone is going to die and have a loved one die at some point. Death is the one universal event that affects every single human being. There are many different cultures in the world, and they all deal with death acceptance, planning for death, and the mourning process differently. This presentation covers only a small portion of the cultures in the world. It focuses on 5 different cultures and how they deal with death and dying. These cultures are China, Vietnam, Japan, Mexico, and the Islamic states. I will preface my presentation with a little bit of information on how the U.S. typically deals with death and dying. Death acceptance. In the U.S., we are mostly open and honest when talking about death. Suicide is generally not accepted, and euthanasia is a hot topic in the U.S., with some people thinking it should be legal and others thinking that it should not be. Planning for death. Living wills are strongly encouraged in the U.S., and most people have them, even at younger ages. Organ donation is also strongly encouraged, but it is a personal choice left up to the individual. Mourning process. Black is worn to funerals traditionally. Cremation and burial are both common. Funeral services are usually based on one's religion. First, I will focus on death acceptance in these different cultures. The first culture I will look at is China. In China, it is considered bad luck to talk about death at all, so families often do not talk to the dying person about their condition. Premature death or death of a child is viewed as bad luck. Because of the Buddhist influence in China and their belief in reincarnation, it is attributed to the child or parent having done something bad in a past life. Suicide is considered unacceptable, but there are some exceptions. For example, women who have been raped or those who have been captured in war. Both passive and active euthanasia are generally accepted, but the family would feel better about doing it if they had some proof that that is what the person would have wanted. Passive euthanasia is when doctors or family stop doing something that is keeping a person alive, like turning off life support. And active euthanasia is when doctors or family do something to cause the person to die, like giving them an overdose of medicine. Next, we will look at Vietnam. In Vietnam, death is considered part of the natural cycle of life. They also believe that dying should be very peaceful, so family members should try to make the person at ease with dying and not scared. Suicide is considered wrong with the exception of war. In Vietnam, it is actually considered honorable to commit suicide rather than surrender to the enemy. Euthanasia is unacceptable. Some Vietnamese do support passive euthanasia, but the majority does not. Our next culture is Japan. In Japan, they believe that death is inevitable and is not final. Because of the Buddhist influence, it is believed you will go through a rebirth cycle until you reach enlightenment. Suicide is considered wrong and disrespectful to your ancestors. Passive euthanasia is acceptable, but active euthanasia is not. Next, we will look at death acceptance in Mexico. In Mexico, death is considered to be in God's hands. In an example story in an article I read, a young boy was angry with God for letting his grandfather die, so he stopped going to church altogether. This shows that even though it is in God's hands, sometimes people still do not accept death. Passive euthanasia is legal in some places in Mexico. Lastly, we will look at the Islamic states. In the Islamic states, they believe that Allah, or God, creates people and decides when they die. They also believe that death is not the end. It is the end to an old life and the start of a new one, either in heaven or hell. In the Islamic states, euthanasia is not acceptable. Next, I will talk about the differences in planning for death in these cultures. In this section, I tried to focus on living wills and organ donation. First, we will look at China. Living wills are not often used in China. This is due to the fact that they believe it is bad luck to talk about death. They are also not in favor of organ donation for a few different reasons. First, they believe that the body should be kept intact. Organ donation is also considered disrespectful to your parents because they are the ones who gave you your body. One article also mentioned some concern that organ recipients would be reborn with the donor's face. The next culture is Vietnam. Most people are not very familiar with living wills in Vietnam. most Vietnamese people are against organ donation. They are afraid they will be missing an organ in the next life. Now we will look at planning for death in Japan. Most people in Japan have living wills because they believe planning for death is a good thing. However, they do not openly support organ donation. The general belief in Japan is that you must be whole in the next life. But since it helps others, some do it almost secretly, although the younger generations are starting to do it more and more. Next, we will look at Mexico. Organ donation is not generally supported in Mexico. This is because they believe the body must be buried intact. The articles I read did not mention living wills, and I could not find much information on them. Lastly, we will look at the Islamic states. The Islamic states have a belief in a lifelong planning process for death. They believe that one's work during life decides where they go when they die. Organ donation is more of a personal choice. Some people believe the body should not be violated, while others believe that saving a life is more important. The last thing I will look at are the different mourning processes of these cultures. Again, we will start with China. In China, there is a general belief that if burial customs are not followed, a hungry ghost will return to bother the living. Many Chinese people believe in ghosts. There are family ghosts, which are nice, and hungry ghosts, which are scary, make people sick, and cause mischief. White is traditionally worn to funerals. Unless it is the funeral of an elderly person, then they wear bright colors. Paper money, cars, servants, etc. are burned at the funeral. This is done to ensure that the deceased have everything they need in the next life. Bodies are not cremated, because traditionally, 25 to 30 years later, the bones are exhumed, washed, and shipped back to China if they were buried somewhere else. Grief is kept within the family. The funerals are more for the living than they are for the dead. All the deceased's possessions are given away as the family will not use them. Our next culture is Vietnam. In Vietnam, the eldest son makes all the funeral arrangements. A priest or monk helps decide the right burial time and place. The body of the deceased is dressed beautifully. Candles are lit at the four corners of the casket to ward off ghosts. White is worn while mourning. Non-family is very important in the mourning process. They attend the funeral and help comfort the family. Ancestors are remembered annually, and they also keep altars to their ancestors in their homes at all times. Next, we will look at Japan. In Japan, the family gathers immediately at the deathbed after death. They do this to be there while a minister reads the Pillow Sutra, which expresses the deceased's gratitude toward life and death. Cremation is preferred over burial. White is worn at funerals, and they celebrate in Oban annually, which is a celebration of the lives of the dead. Now we will look at Mexico. In Mexico, traditionally, processions take the deceased to the cemetery. Candles are also lit at the church altar for 9 days after the death. In Mexico, funerals are a time to be open and expressive with emotions. They also participate in the Day of the Dead every year, which is a celebration of those who have passed. Lastly, we will look at the Islamic states. In the Islamic states, burial typically has to occur within 24 hours of death. They are also very concerned with keeping physical purity after death, so same-sex members gently wash the body before burial. Cremation is not favored, and they generally do not like autopsies because they believe God had his own reason for death, and autopsies also disfigure the body. Funerals fulfill the society's need to recover from the loss of a member. The research I did revealed that although culture plays a big part in how people deal with death and dying, it is not the only thing that contributes to it. Things like religion, education, and time spent in the U.S. also affect how people accept death, plan for death, and mourn the deceased. There are many similarities to how people deal with death and dying across the world, but there are also some very extreme differences.